Taxes was taxing. Now taxes is relaxing when you file for free.
I can file for free? TurboTax Free Edition. Roughly 37% of filers qualify. Simple Form 1040 returns only. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free. I can file for free.
Now this is taxes. File for free with TurboTax Free Edition and get your maximum refund. No schedules except for Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, and Student Loan Interest. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free.
Welcome back, listeners, to Bloodstained Backstories, the podcast where we explore the dark, fascinating, and often forgotten corners of history. I'm your host, Jace.
And I'm Summer. Today we are diving into one of the most infamous moments in American crime, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This brutal event sent shockwaves through Chicago and the entire nation. On February 14th, 1929, 7 men were murdered in cold blood, and the crime would become one of the most notorious in American criminal history.
And what makes this story so compelling is not just the shocking violence of the massacre, but the way it reflected on the larger power struggle between rival mobsters during the Prohibition era. We'll be exploring the key players in this violent world, the details of the massacre itself, and how it ultimately changed the course of organized crime in America.
And let's not forget the mystery that still surrounds the case. Even though the massacre was carried out with alarming precision, the identities of the perpetrators and the true mastermind behind it remain subjects of debate to this day. So buckle up, listeners, because we're about to take you into the heart of one of the darkest chapters of Chicago's criminal past.
Before we get to the massacre itself, we need to understand the context. Chicago in 1929 was a city on the edge, controlled by violent gangs and marred by corruption. Prohibition, which had been enacted in the decade earlier in 1919, made the production, sale, and distribution of alcohol illegal. But as we all know, when things are illegal, if there's a demand, there'll always be a supply, whether or not it's legal.
That's where the gangsters came in. Al Capone, the leader of the South Side Italian mob, dominated the bootlegging trade in Chicago. He had an iron grip on the city, controlling everything from speakeasies to illegal alcohol shipments. But Capone wasn't the only player. A man named George Bugs Moran was also trying to carve out his own slice of the bootlegging pie with his North Side Irish gang.
And this rivalry between Capone and Moran would set the stage for this massacre. By 1929, Moran had been gaining ground, particularly with his expansion into the lucrative bootlegging business. Capone couldn't afford to let it happen, so the war between these two powerful men began to escalate. And, as you might expect in the world of organized crime, things would turn violent.
So here's where things get interesting though. Capone wanted to eliminate Moran and his entire gang, but he wasn't about to dirty his own hands. Enter Jack Machine Gun McGurn, one of Capone's most trusted enforcers, who would become the key figure in orchestrating the massacre.
The plan was simple but deadly. McGurn and his associates would disguise themselves as police officers. This was critical because the gangsters would be able to enter the garage undetected and catch Moran's men off guard. The target was Moran's headquarters, a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, which had become a hub for his operations.
And this is where the meticulous planning really shows. At 10:30 a.m. on February 14th, 6 men dressed as police officers arrived at the garage in a police car. Where'd they get the uniforms in the police car from? They approached the building, seemingly without raising suspicion. Once inside, they ordered Moran's men to line up against the wall, and then they opened fire. 2 Thompson submachine guns spraying bullets into the group. It lasted less than 15 seconds.
7 men were killed in the brutal attack, including Frank the Enforcer Gusenberg and James Jimmy Clark, key members of Moran's gang. What's chilling is that Frank Gusenberg, the only one that survived long enough to be questioned, famously refused to name his attackers even though he was riddled with bullets. Snitches get stitches.
The massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago. But here's the twist. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, Capone himself was never directly linked to it. Authorities had little evidence to go on, and the men who carried out the killings were wearing police uniforms, making identification even harder.
And while the public was outraged, the massacre didn't immediately bring down Capone. However, it did contribute to the growing pressure on law enforcement to act. At this time, Chicago's police force was notoriously corrupt, and gangsters like Capone were largely able to operate with immunity. But after the massacre, the city, and the federal government, began to take organized crime more seriously.
And Jace, let's not forget the bigger picture. The massacre wasn't just about getting rid of Moran's gang. It was about sending a message. Capone was sending a very clear signal that he was in charge, that anyone who dared challenge him would face violent retribution, and that message was heard loud and clear, but not just in Chicago, but across the entire nation.
Now let's dive into some of the theories surrounding the massacre. For years, people had speculated about the true mastermind behind the killings. Was Capone directly responsible, or was it someone else within the organization, maybe McGurn, who was known for his violent methods?
And there's also the theory that law enforcement, which was deeply corrupt at the time, may have been involved, or at least complicit in allowing the massacre to happen. Some even believe that rival factions within the underworld, other gangs, or even corrupt politicians might have had a hand in it. But ultimately, it's impossible to know for sure. The crime was carried out so efficiently that it left almost no trace behind.
The fact that Capone was never directly charged for the massacre is a testament to how deeply entrenched the corruption and violence were in Chicago at the time. Even though law enforcement and the public knew who was likely behind it, proving it in court was another matter entirely.
So what was the lasting impact of the St. Valentine's Day massacre? Well, for one thing, it marked a turning point in public perception. The massacre made it very clear that Prohibition had created a breeding ground for violence on a scale that most people couldn't ignore any longer. This was the moment when organized crime became a national issue.
And while Capone's reign of terror continued for a few more years, the increased law enforcement attention, particularly from the federal government, is what led to his downfall. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion, something that had been under investigation for years, but that's what finally put him behind bars for good.
And for Moran, the massacre was a devastating blow. His power was decimated, and he never was able to fully recover. Despite surviving the attack, Moran's gang was effectively wiped out, and he faded into relative obscurity after the massacre.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains one of the most brutal and well-known crimes in American history. It's a chilling reminder of the bloodshed and violence that fueled the rise of organized crime during Prohibition. And though Capone's empire eventually crumbled, the echoes of that day still resonate with the lore of Chicago's criminal past.
That's all for today's episodes of Bloodstained Backstories. We hope you enjoy this deep dive into one of the most infamous moments in American crime history. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a comment if you like the show.
And be sure to join us next time when we uncover another dark chapter from the past. I'm Jace.
And I'm Summer. Stay curious, stay safe, and keep looking to the past to understand the present.